Our speaker today is Ron King. He is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at San Diego State University. He is the author of 5 books, including Major Studies of U.S. Taxation and Welfare Entitlement Policies, 2 edited collections of essays, and more than 40 refereed journal articles, essays, and book chapters. You will never see him and Big Bird in the same room at the same time, and there's a reason for that. He has received 2 major Fulbright Awards and multiple research grants. He plays for the San Diego Chargers, even though they left our entire city, but he stayed behind to play all on his own. He has received, his most recent research examines the complications of democratization over time, focusing especially on the US removal of the property qualification for voting and on Romanian transition from authoritarian rule. Every year he dresses as a vampire to stalk a family chosen at random. We are so thrilled he's here. I hope I've spiced up your boring bio enough. Here he is, Professor King.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Am I off mute? I'm good. Okay. What you didn't say is that I go to Mardi Gras every year and do dress up. First of all, let me thank you for this invitation and commend you all. I'm not sure you realize it, but it's important to recognize and respect citizen assemblies, where people come together and construct communities of mutual caring and support. And so I say to you all, well done. I mean, this is an important thing that you do. I'm a data wonk, which means I can frighten graduate students with ease and put a class of undergraduates to sleep within minutes. I'm going to do my damnedest today not to bore you all. But what I want to discuss with you is democratic voting rules and voting rights. It's a timely topic this time of year. The basic data are relatively clear. There's not a lot of disagreement among the scholars. And I suspect many of you are somewhat knowledgeable about that. But somehow the news seems to get it wrong and frightens us where it shouldn't and doesn't frighten us where it should. So first of all, I want to start as an introduction to say that democracy is a somewhat astounding phenomenon, that it involves ex ante uncertainty, ex post irreversibility, and repetition. Ex ante uncertainty, which means that it's that in any election, the opposition could potentially win, that elections are not a sham, that the outs can actually take power. Ex post irreversibility, the outcome is respected, that whoever wins is expected to take power, that the military isn't going to reject the result, for example. And reversibility, that you do it again every few years. And what's odd about this is that we expect it to occur naturally. That's to say, politicians whose careers and reputations and policies depend on the outcome are expected to allow open, uncertain competition with opponents who stand for a different and often despised direction for the country. And so therefore, it's not surprising that politicians, even within the overall structure of the democratic leadership game, still will try to tilt the rules in their favor. I don't think that's a surprising phenomenon. We see this from the beginning of American history. In Delaware in 1787, the first federal election, in one district, the Radical Party organized a celebration at the polls with bands and flags and the militia. The conservative state government rejected the result, moved the polling place to a house of a loyalist supporter, surrounded that house with its own militia. Surprise, 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 they won, and the conservative state government locked in the result. In New Jersey in 1807, in one district, voting turnout was 297%. That's 3 times the size of the legally entitled electorate. During late Reconstruction, there was considerable violence, intimidation, fraud, especially by the white redeemers. So my favorite example is East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, which had a black voting majority. They reported 0 votes for the Party of Reconstruction and all their votes for the Party of White Segregation. And everything depended upon it because the presidency in that year was decided by one electoral vote, and which votes you counted in Louisiana determined whether Hayes or Tilden became president. So what about today? Despite all the screams and yells in the social media, there is very, very, very little intentional voter fraud. For example, there's little voter impersonation where you claim to be somebody else. There's extraordinarily little multiple voting. A recent study found 31 possible examples from 2000 to 2014. That's 1 billion votes. Another recent study found 4 possible cases in 2016. Using the most pessimistic estimates, individual level voter fraud would have no effect on any outcome decided by more than 20 to 40 votes. And almost every outcome is decided by more than 20 to 40 votes. There's been a handful of successful prosecutions for voter fraud over the past 2 decades. So please distrust the populist stories. There's a recent one of a garbage can filled with ballots. The full story is those ballots were from a previous election. They were clearly each one marked as so and were disposed of legally. So there's very little fraud. The screams and yells these days comes about mail-in ballots. And again, there's very little intentional fraud here. What there is accident and human error. It's not fraud. It's what happens when you're processing millions of ballots dealing with people. And people aren't perfect, especially mail-in ballots. In the 2020 primaries, 500,000 mail-in ballots were invalidated. 500,000. So the question is, what do you do when a person forgets to sign or date or prints their name rather than uses a signature? What about an unclear signature? Some states require a witness signature, and that's sometimes forgotten. What if they post the ballot late on election day and then it gets picked up a day later and delivered to the counters 2 days after that? What if someone says, oh, I didn't mean to vote for that person, puts a big X through it and says, no, ignore this. And with COVID, there's going to be an unprecedented number of mail-in or hand-delivered ballots this year. And some of them are going to be contested on technicalities. So the dilemma is, do we follow the letter of the law? Those laws were often written under past circumstances and often with a bias in favor of in-person voting and fears that someone may be misrepresenting unless I see the person face to face in the polling booth. Or do we do our best to sort of read the intention of the voter, trying to facilitate democracy? But lawyers usually don't view it that way. And in the ambiguity of what is and what is not a valid ballot, there's enormous temptation for politicians to try to read the things in their favor and not in other people's favor. And in any close election, some side is going to scream and yell whether you count them leniently or strictly. But the real problem of the US electoral system is not, and I want to say this very clearly, is not really about invalidated voters, and it's not about fraud. It's about the underlying rules and structures of the political game. And so if there's not a lot of illegal manipulation, there's lots of legal manipulation. Elections are constituted by a complex set of formal rules determining who can vote, when you vote, where you vote, how you vote, what is a valid vote, who certifies the vote, and what outcome is considered winning. That these rules are often controversial. They affect the electoral fortunes of organized parties, politicians, factions, and interests. And therefore, it's not surprising that those organized parties, politicians, factions, and interests have a stake in tilting the rules in their direction. It's always been that way. At the founding of the United States, for example, the 13 original colonies limited voting to men who own property, especially real estate. The justification by elites was that property gave men independence and it established belonging to the community. Voting was sort of a corporate privilege. If you owned in the corporation, you got a right to vote. And of course, it was controversial. There was even a revolution in Rhode Island in 1842 called Dorr's Rebellion against the property holders' government. It took 3/4 of a century to get rid of the property rule. And there's a wonderful, famous Benjamin Franklin stories. I love Ben Franklin stories. It's about a man who bought a donkey. And owning the donkey gave him just enough property to qualify for voting. And as a consequence, he learned quite a bit about voting rules and elections and qualifications and candidates. But unfortunately, before the next election, the donkey died. And now he was disenfranchised. Tell me, he inquired with disappointment, does the right to vote reside in the man or in his ass? You cannot comprehend the passage of the 15th Amendment, so-called Negro franchise, without including the desire of the Republican Party to get votes in contested border states. Blacks could vote in the South. It was a condition of readmission to the Union. Where they couldn't vote was border states. They couldn't vote in California, where the 1849 Constitution specified voting only for adult white male citizens. And California actually voted against the 15th Amendment. You can't understand women's franchise, the 19th Amendment, without its political link to prohibition forces. You can't understand the 18-year-old vote without the desire of the Democratic Party to benefit from the youth. In politics, profound changes are often the product of much more mundane motivations. So what about today? Importantly, the United States does not rank at the very top among the advanced industrial democracies. It's not, we're number one, we're not. The Economist ranks the United States 25th out of 167, towards the top group, but not at the very top. The top are Norway, Iceland, and New Zealand. Polity4, a political science site, gives the United States 8 out of 10, slightly less than a full democracy. Freedom House gives the United States an 86 out of 100. Norway scores 100, Netherlands 99, New Zealand 97. So why does the United States rank towards the top group but not at the very top? Well, first of all, who has the right to vote? Obviously, felons is an issue that has been in the headlines lately. Only Maine and Vermont allow felons while in prison to vote, and that's only by absentee ballot. I still do not understand why if someone commits a felony, I'm talking about boosting a car when they were younger or a minor drug conviction, they lose their political rights. But only Maine or Vermont allow you to vote while in prison. Another 16 states allow you to vote upon release. 21, including California, after parole or probation. 11 states are even more strict than that. Al Gore would have been president in 2000. Florida at the time permanently prohibited felons and ex-felons from voting. And if that were a more liberalized rule, Al Gore would have been president of the United States. So these things have consequences. Who else can't vote in the United States? People in the territories. Do you remember no taxation without representation? And the British respond, no, you don't get the right to vote, you're a colony. Well, what do you think we say to Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands and Guam? You're a territory. Consistency is not a major feature of political life. What about permanent resident aliens? We live in a world where we're increasingly, it's a global world. We live in places where we're not citizens for long periods of time. And many countries, but not the United States, are adapting and allowing, especially for local elections, resident non-citizens to vote. The United States, it's only citizens. And even if you've not been in the United States for decades, if you're still a citizen, you have the right to vote. But the biggest effect of all is registration rules. About 24% of eligible voters are not registered to vote. And so we have low turnout, about 55% in the last presidential election. It's low, enormously low compared to eligible voters. It's only moderately low compared to registered voters. Many countries have no registration requirement at all. Everybody gets a national ID. You show your national ID. They swipe it electronically to show whether you voted and that you voted and that you can't vote elsewhere. And you go home. In the United States, it's your obligation to register. except in North Dakota, where there's no registration rules because states are on their own. But in most states, you have to register weeks before the election. That average people, yeah, they register and they re-register if they move, which is somewhat of a burden. But those people who are least connected to the political system don't think about elections until literally election day. There are some states that allow for same-day registration, but most do not. And therefore, those least attached to the political system tend to be most forgotten. The defenders of registration say voting should only be for those who think about politics and intend to participate. But that's an undemocratic claim. And so the question is, how much do we want to facilitate mass participation? Other things that affect turnout, not enormously, but just enough to note. Voting on Tuesdays. Okay, California stretched it a bit. But Tuesday voting, not a weekend, not a national holiday, has a small but statistically distinct impact, especially on single parents, on hourly wage workers, on workers with multiple jobs. It has a small but real partisan impact, benefiting, in this case, the Republican Party and disadvantaging Democrats. Where you vote, each state is responsible for establishing sufficient polling places. But you know, there's a temptation to provide lots of polling places where your supporters live and fewer where your opponents live. Voting in districts means the districts are gerrymandered. But even more than that, the Senate is an undemocratic set of districts. It violates one person, one vote. A resident of Wyoming has 70 times the congressional political power than a resident of California because of the unrepresentative Senate. How do you vote? Each state determines its own method of voting. So California doesn't buy these bubbled scantrons. So what's a sufficient bubble? And how do we determine that? And what is truly filled in? And who certifies the election? And that may be a problem this year. It was a problem in 1896, where the states produced multiple counts and it went to a special commission. And on that commission, there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and guess who was elected president? Or 2000, where the states couldn't decide and it went to the Supreme Court. But the biggest issue is who determines winning. And here we have to think about the Electoral College. That there was no clear plan with the Electoral College. The Pennsylvania radicals wanted a popular vote. And that's what most countries do. That if no one gets 50% plus 1, you have a runoff second election so that the person is at least democratically endorsed. Others want a selection by the Congress. And some countries do this. It's called a parliamentary system, where the chief executive is named by the parliament. But in the founding fathers, they wanted separation of powers and didn't want so much integration of president and Congress. So it took 3 months and intricate wrangling and ultimately a subcommittee of 11 people. And there was a compromise without much enthusiasm. But the Electoral College is relatively undemocratic. We measure this in 2 ways. The first is unnecessary votes. Those votes that if they weren't cast would make no difference. So if you have an enormous Democratic majority in California or an enormous Republican majority in Mississippi, large numbers of the votes don't matter. If they weren't cast, it would have no impact on the outcome. The other way of judging it is what's called seat vote ratios. How many votes does it take to win an electoral vote? And the answer is anything more than sort of 50-50 is a distortion. The United States has substantial bias in seat vote ratios. Sometimes very narrow elections produce very large electoral votes differences. Will it change? No, of course not. For 100 years, it meant nothing. It made no difference at all. And over the last number of years, it's had mattered twice, 2000 and 2016. Both times the advantages went to the Republicans. And given you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to change anything, partisan fears and worries alone will mean that nothing's going to change. So what's the conclusion from this talk? Despite the screams and yells, there are 3 overlapping dimensions. At the individual level, the data is clear. There's very little intentional fraud and abuse. The same cannot be said at the elite level, of political actors. At the implementation level, it's not intentional fraud, it's the complication of counting systems, especially dealing with human beings, with their confusions and their mistakes, which leaves the door open for interpretation in one's interest. And when elections are close, there'll always be worries about unfair interpretations in borderline cases. But at the structural level, we spend a lot less attention. It's how the rules of the game are constructed. And this is where the main bias of our electoral system exists. It's long run and essential. It has to do with who can vote, where you vote, when you vote, how you vote, what constitutes winning. These rules are not neutral in their effect. They determine, any given election aside, the quality of our democracy. And it's important to attend to those because they set the rules of the game. Why does all this matter? Because voting is both an instrumental act and an expressive act. As an instrumental act, it provides the opportunity to articulate your concerns and your policy preferences and assures permeability to the government and responsiveness from the government. But even more important is voting as an expressive act. Suffrage conveys dignity and status. It's a symbol of recognized citizenship, of full incorporation into civil society. And so inclusion of increasing numbers, especially among the previously underrepresented groups, is something we must cherish both for what it means and for what it can do. And we must be concerned when political elites, in the heat of the contest, forget about the deeper values of democracy and democratic governance, focusing instead on how they might adapt the rules and somewhat undermine the process in the narrow quest for personal victory. Anyhow, I hope I've helped clarify the subject a bit. It's a subject of considerable attention in this election. And again, I thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful illustration of participatory community engagement. So I thank you.